The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of 8 News Now or Nexstar Media Group.
We're hoping we're going to be able to have those very meaningful and productive conversations.
Tonight on Politics Now, can Democrats and Republicans work together in Carson City? Hear from both sides on their budget priorities as the session gets underway. Plus,
we have to get Nevada back to work and the kids back in the schools.
What role schools and economic development will play in this legislative session? And a spike in student suicides, the ideas on how to try and turn around a growing problem.
From 8 News Now, this is Politics Now.
Thank you very much for joining us on Politics Now. I'm John Langland. The Nevada legislative session is officially underway. Several major issues need to be tackled, but first, all lawmakers and staff were tested for the coronavirus before they went into the Capitol. Earlier this week, new lawmakers were sworn in, leadership positions named. Democratic Assembly Speaker Jason Frierson and Senate Leader Nicole Cannizzaro are staying in their positions. The topic looming over the entire session is the budget. How can lawmakers pay for state services with such a drop in tax revenue?
Whether it's social justice or, revenue, I think that we're going to have to deal with those and struggle through some of those areas where we might not agree, but also be willing to find some common ground and compromises.
We have a very antiquated tax system and a very complicated tax system. Do we need to have an overview of the Nevada tax system? Absolutely.
Democrats will need to compromise if they want to raise taxes. They lost their supermajority in the legislature back in November. That means Democrats need some Republicans to vote with them to raise revenue. The I-Team's David Charnes was up in Carson City for the start of the session and joins us here now to talk about some of the priorities up in Carson City. David, what are they saying about where this money is going to come from?
Well, certainly at the start of the session, it was sort of this very kumbaya feel. But I asked Senate Majority Leader Nicole Cannizzaro where the money will come from, and I asked her some other questions as well. Here's what she said.
This is probably a tough session because we have a budget to find money for. We have social services, education, roads, all this to fund. And obviously the pandemic has limited some of that income. So what are some ways that we're going to be able to find compromise in the Senate?
I think the first and foremost piece of that is that we really do have to work together. We have to work together as a legislative body for the betterment of the state. And so I of course, again, remain hopeful that we're going to be able to find a way to do that. But with respect to the budget concerns, I think it's going to mean that we're going to spend a lot of time looking at each and every budget decision to make sure that we're doing everything we can to keep those vital services for Nevadans and to help move the state out of our economic situation and into a better place, right? So those budget decisions are going to be so important. Additionally, we're going to keep all options on the table in terms of revenue. We're of course always hopeful that the federal government is going to help come in and support states like Nevada.
There's some discussion from your Republican colleagues about looking at executive power and making it more of a bipartisan solution. The discussion is, well, why are we in a state of emergency for 10 months? I think you and I know why. I mean, we're wearing masks. But they say, it's not necessarily about our current governor, but in governors in future situations. Is that something that you want to look at as well?
I will say this, we are still in a state of emergency 10 months into this pandemic because we are still in the middle of a global pandemic. We still are seeing that hospitals are struggling to make sure that they can keep up with taking care of everyone who walks in their doors, whether they be there because of a COVID diagnosis or for some other medical treatment. We know that there are still people who are dying from this disease and families who are losing family members. So until we're out of a pandemic, we're still in the middle of the emergency, which necessitated the declaration of emergency.
Does anything change now that Democrats lost seats in that there is more bipartisanship that needs to happen than in years past? Does that change anything for you?
So in the Senate, we're actually a 1-seat difference. So I don't know that it has changed too much from our standpoint. And we've always endeavored to work in a bipartisan fashion. I think if you actually take a look at the bills that we pass, that doesn't mean we always agree on everything, right? That doesn't mean we're all 100% because we all represent different constituencies, we all come with different viewpoints, and we have sometimes different things that we're advocating for. But the one thing that I think we've always been able to do is to sit down and talk about those differences. And for the most part, we tend to agree, and we tend to find the path forward to make Nevada better.
Kumbaya indeed, David. So in that interview, you asked Senator Cannizzaro about trying to limit emergency powers. Several Republicans have talked about that in the last month. Is that still going to be a priority now that the session is underway?
Yeah, so it really does seem like it is certainly one of their priorities, John. And then certainly another one that they have to do every time is the budget. Now, I asked Republican Assembly Floor Leader Dr. Robin Titus about this as well, and here's what she said about that.
We have to get Nevada back to work and the kids back in the schools, and that has to be a priority without question on that. We met Saturday at the caucus. We have a list of priorities that we'll be sending out and things that we go on and work on, bills that we'll be introducing. But back to work, back to school.
How excited are you to get this session underway?
Very excited. I think there's things and problems that need to be solved. Our state and obviously the nation wants to see somebody somewhere do something good and work together. I think we can do that here in Nevada.
You may want to look at some executive power provisions, how much power the governor has to close the state, election security things. Are you going to entertain that?
Well, that is one of our priorities, defining the executive branch emergency orders. What is that role? It's not about the governor. It's not about this governor. It's about what in the NRS. We need clarification on NRS. Nobody anticipated an extended emergency. This isn't just, when you have an emergency, we've had flooding before. We've had crises before. Nowhere in our NRS defines an extended emergency, so we need clarification. I think that can be a bipartisan ask.
Did that governor err in his power in any way? Did he overstep by looking at it?
I think the governor did what the governor felt he had the right to do because there's no other direction. And I think that's what we need, definition. So currently there's no rules that say otherwise.
Has Democratic leadership reached out to you at all about tax increases or tax deals at all? Interesting.
The Democrats have not reached out to us to say, what taxes would you be willing to support? They have, in the governor's state of the state, that he did not mention any tax increases. Leadership has not reached out and said, hey, we have we're really going to need to do this. What's the possibility? So they may say that, oh, well, it takes people at the table, but they have not reached out to say what's a reasonable discussion.
So that bill is written, AB 93 is the number, is written by Republican Assemblyman Jim Wheeler, and it would end a state of emergency after 15 days unless the legislature actually votes to approve it.
Interesting. So David, again, there's broadly a positive vibe, it seems like, early on in the legislative session, but there has already been a little bit of controversy. New Republican Assemblywoman Annie Black stirred some controversy up. She was in Washington, D.C. January 6th at the Trump rally.
Yeah, so she was there. She was at the rally part of all those, what was going on that day. She didn't go in the Capitol building. Some Democrats had called for her to resign, but she told me that on day one, she was actually being welcomed with open arms.
They respect my First Amendment right to free speech, and I didn't break any laws, so that's what they're telling me. So that's all I know.
Now, there was also a little work that got underway this week. Since the start of the pandemic, of course, 20 Clark County School District students have died by suicide. Now, this new law to be debated this session would require school districts have a pandemic plan and also a plan to deal with suicide as part of their emergency procedures. The Nevada Department of Education actually requested lawmakers to talk about this bill, and lawmakers on both sides say this is certainly critical interaction, and that critical interaction between students and teachers is really key.
They're going to have that interaction with their teacher. Teachers and others are mandatory reporters. They see what's going on. They can ask questions. They can see if there's something troubling a student, if something has changed in their lives.
For all different reasons, kids get down and get disconnected. And so we just need to make sure that we have all the resources that we absolutely can provide from every entity and every group so that these kids have support.
Now, they also want to see if there's any trend between students who had access to in-person learning and those who did not, John.
Yeah, David, a very important issue across the state of Nevada. Appreciate that, sir. Now, another bill being debated up in Carson City would let police officers sue members of the public. Assembly Bill 92 was introduced by Republican Assemblyman Jim Wheeler. It would allow a peace officer to sue someone who injured them, prevented them from doing their job, or filed a false complaint. A first hearing has not yet been scheduled. On Tuesday, Clark County Commissioners picked 2 new members of the state legislature. Public health worker Democrat Fabian Donate now represents State Senate District 10. He said on Twitter he is excited to fight for public health and improving the lives of all Nevadans. Donate replaces Ivana Kinsella, who joined the Biden administration. Tracy Brown May is the new Assemblywoman for District 42. She is Director of Advocacy, Board, and Government Relations over at Opportunity Village. She replaces Alex Acefa, who resigned amid a campaign finance scandal. Next on Politics Now, Republicans versus Big Tech. The sections of U.S. law that shield tech companies from those lawsuits. Our Vanessa Murphy looks into what would actually happen if it was repealed. Plus,
I'm Alexandra Limon in Washington. Coming up, we'll take a look at President Biden's immigration policies and why it will likely be very difficult for the administration to reunite immigrant families.
Welcome back to Politics Now.
President Joe Biden has signed an executive order aimed at reuniting families separated at the border. A federal task force will try and find those parents. At least 650 whose parents were separated from their children and deported to Mexico and Central America. Local immigration advocates applauded the decision.
Making sure that he's actually keeping promises that he made during the campaign trail. And I think that's very, very important. I think one of the most important policies for me right now is the fact that he is going to develop that task force to make sure that he's reuniting those families that were actually separated under the Trump administration.
President Joe Biden has made immigration a top priority. He has signed a whole bunch of executive orders on that issue, sending a proposed bill to Congress. We're joined now, as you can see there, by our Washington correspondent, Alexandra Limon, to break down what the president's done so far. Let's get started here, Alex. What have we seen from the White House?
We saw President Biden initially on his very first day in office sign some executive orders, but this week he actually signed additional executive orders on immigration. And when he was signing them this week, he said, I'm not making new policy here. I'm just eliminating bad policy. And what he means is that by and large, all of these immigration executive orders basically simply undo the hardline immigration policies that we saw enacted under President Trump, also via executive order. So some of the newest orders that were signed by Biden this week, for example, address or at least ordered various departments to take a look at, how people are applying for asylum and visas and green cards and even citizenship, because under the Trump administration, we did see all of those processes become much more difficult and much more expensive. And it was just, slowly becoming harder and harder for people to apply for, legal entry into the United States.
Can we expect any additional actions on immigration from the president? These seem to be measures more to sort of reverse what the former president did, the Trump administration. What about moving forward?
So there's a couple of things that could happen. We could see more executive orders from President Biden, particularly on the issue of the use of for-profit immigration detention centers. This is something that President Biden during the campaign had promised he would eliminate the use of these private for-profit centers, immigration detention centers. And we actually already saw Biden take action when it comes to private prisons and directing the DOJ to eliminate and phase out the contracts with private for-profit prisons.
And that was Alexandra Limon from Washington, D.C. Next on Politics Now, Republicans versus Big Tech.
It does not only protect big tech. It protects tiny websites. It protects users like you and me.
The GOP takes aim at laws protecting tech companies from lawsuits. The I-Team's Vanessa Murphy looks into the issue. Plus, we look at 2 notable deaths in Nevada politics this week on Politics Now.
You're watching Politics Now.
Republicans have been targeting tech companies recently, claiming conservatives are being unfairly censored. They've set their sights on a law known as Section 230 and have pushed to repeal it. Essentially, Section 230 protects tech companies like Facebook and Twitter from legal liability for what users post there. Vanessa Murphy spoke with noted First Amendment attorney Ari Cohn, who handles Section 230 issues and breaks it all down.
I think the easiest, simplest way to explain Section 230 is the people who are liable for things on the internet are the people who created those things on the internet. What Section 230 does is it prevents me, say, from holding Twitter liable for something that somebody else posted, among other things. It also protects users. If I retweet something that is defamatory, the original author of the tweet has to be sued, not me. But it's also important to remember, and this gets lost in a lot of the shuffle, is that much of what Section 230 protects is stuff that the First Amendment protects anyways. A lot of the lawsuits you see for content moderation, for banning users and things like that, those would be dismissed on First Amendment grounds anyways, eventually, just with a lot greater time and expense. It's just a shortcut for the courts. But getting rid of Section 230 doesn't mean that Twitter couldn't ban Donald Trump. It doesn't mean that it can't moderate content that it finds objectionable. All it would do is mean it would cost Twitter a little bit more to defend against the lawsuits. It simply says Twitter or Facebook or any website or any Facebook group for that matter is not the publisher of things that users post. That's it. No more, no less.
2020, 2021, it becomes the center of this political argument. What can you say about that?
In the current political climate, what you have is two sets of arguments. You have the argument that social media companies aren't doing enough to remove harmful content. Generally speaking, most people perceive those as coming from the left side of the political spectrum. And then you have the people perceived on the right side of the spectrum who say social media companies are discriminating against conservatives, they're banning users, they're removing content, and they should lose this protection as a result of them not being open to all voices, quote unquote. So when you're talking about that right side of the spectrum, when it comes to content moderation, again, the thing that you have to remember is these decisions are protected by the First Amendment. Social media companies could do them one way or the other, whether Section 230 existed or not.
So if I'm your average Joe on Facebook, on Twitter, or posting a review on Amazon for a product, the way it stands right now, what does this all mean for me?
Well, if Section 230 ceased to exist tomorrow, there's two things that could happen. One thing that could happen is companies on the internet could just say, we're not going to moderate anymore, throw their hands up in the air and say it's not worth the risk. Then you end up with an internet that is so full of garbage that nobody wants to do anything about, that it becomes so much more unusable than it can already be at times. If they decide to moderate, what's going to happen is they're going to over-moderate. They're going to take things and moderate it to high heavens. You might see delays in your posts going up, or you might just see things being taken down at astonishing rates. I mean, if they decide to tighten up the machine learning and AI content moderation controls and say, be even more overcautious, you could see a whole bunch of stuff just getting taken down, perhaps even without a human ever looking at it, just because the motivation will be to avoid liability. There won't be a motivation to do it well. There'll be a motivation to do it well enough that they don't get sued.
Section 230 was passed as part of the Communications Decency Act in 1996. It was amended in 2008 to require the removal of material that violates federal and state sex trafficking laws. In other political news, there were two notable deaths, unfortunately, in the Nevada political world this week. Longtime Las Vegas political consultant Dan Hart passed away. He was 66 years old. Friends say he died of a heart attack Tuesday night. Hart started by working on the campaigns of Democrats like former Las Vegas Mayor Jan Jones back in the 90s. More recently, he worked on ballot initiative campaigns for the Nevada State Education Association, one of the big teachers unions. Second Amendment advocate Don Turner also passed away this week. Turner was president of the Nevada Firearms Coalition. He lost a long battle with cancer on Monday. He was one of the strongest lobbying voices for the gun rights community here in Nevada. Next on Politics Now, changing the name. The latest push to remove former Nevada Senator Pat McCarran's name from McCarran Airport. Next on Politics Now.
You're watching Politics Now.
The Nevada State Democratic Party has to pick a new chairperson. Current chairman William McCurdy II says he is not running again. McCurdy is now on the Clark County Commission, says he wants to focus on that job instead. Nevada Democrats will pick new leadership March 6th. Democratic Clark County Commissioner Tick Segerblum is pushing once again to rename McCarran International Airport after former Senator Harry Reid. Segerblum tried this 4 years ago up in the legislature, but it failed. Right now he's on the Clark County Commission, and he has a couple of other commissioners backing him as well. Former Senator McCarran has often been criticized for his anti-Semitic views and actions when he served. The FAA would still have to sign off on any new name if Clark County decides to change it. Now, we did an unscientific Twitter poll to ask your opinion. More than 830 of you voted, and 26% of you agreed to change the name. 74% disagreed. This week in What to Watch, the start of former President Donald Trump's impeachment trial is starting. Opening arguments in the Senate trial begin next week. At this point, the former president is not expected to testify in person. Some senators are also pushing for a potential censure of the former president instead of impeachment. And the Nevada legislature continues. Budget hearings are underway for state agencies. We are keeping an eye on to see what is going to get cut in order to help them meet their budgets. Thank you very much for watching Politics Now this week. Stay up to date online and watch us every Saturday. Take care.